in person and virtually. So if you are attending virtually, I'll just remind you, please stay on mute so that our speakers aren't distracted. And keep any questions you have until the end, but feel free to put those in the chat, and as usual, I will moderate those at the end. But I will go ahead and get us started. So I want to welcome everyone back and thank you to our speakers today. We have Dr. Barbara Roth from our own UNLV Department of Anthropology, who specializes in the study of prehistoric cultures in the southwestern US. Her main areas of interest include the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, the social changes, household organization, gender roles that result as groups become more sedentary and agriculturally dependent, and community development in the Mimbres, oh geez, how do I pronounce this, Barb? Hewn region of southwestern New Mexico. She has directed excavations of several pit house period sites in the Mimbres region and more recently worked at the Elk Ridge site, a large classic period pueblo located in the Mimbres River Valley. Her and her co-speakers are going to speak about that work today in their talk entitled Rough Hewn Rocks and Pretty Pottery, Making Sense of Mimbres Material Culture at the Elk Ridge site. Thank you both. I'm going to welcome you and turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Barb Roth.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Well, I'm going to start off. This is a literal tag team. I'm going to start off kind of summarizing our work at Elk Ridge, and then Dylan and Danny are both doing their dissertations on using material culture from the site. So they're going to go into more details on that. After I've kind of talked about it. Elk Ridge is a classic period Mimbres pueblo, so it dates from about AD 1000 to 1130. And it also has an underlying pit house component that dates from about 550 to 1000. It's in the northern part of the river valley, so its environment is a little bit different than some of the other. I know Karen, Dr. Harry is here, and Dr. Harry worked at Nan Ranch in the southern valley. So our environment is a little bit different. It's a little bit riskier for agriculture because of that. And the other thing about Elk Ridge that makes it interesting is that it, again, is the northernmost, and it's basically where the Mimbres Valley starts to move up toward the Gila River Valley. And so what our goals were was to kind of look at how the environment influenced the occupation there. The other thing that really makes Elk Ridge interesting and different is that this is the Mimbres River, and every other pit house pueblo site is on the river, but Elk Ridge is right over here. So they could have had farm fields here, they could have had farm fields over here, down here, really opened up where they could put their fields. And we think that one of the main reasons they're sitting there is because there's a spring, a natural spring there. So constant supply of water. We have been working at the northern part of the site. The southern part of the site has a very sad history. This little area right here, you can see the arroyo cutting through. We've been working along that arroyo. The site we estimate is about 200 rooms. This northern part is owned by the U.S. Forest Service and is very protected, very, very deep, because of its setting away from the river, very, very deeply buried by alluvial deposits. And sadly, the southern part was on private land for many years. And in 1989, New Mexico passed a burial law and prohibiting excavations of burials on state lands and any kind of trafficking in burial goods. And the landowner, because of that arroyo that we've been working on, the landowner saw that there was material there, and 6 months before the burial law passed, he bulldozed that portion of the site. Thankfully, you can see how deeply buried it is. So he damaged a lot, but he could have done much, much worse. But because it was so deeply buried, he wasn't able to. He did, we have many people that have told us that along the main road that goes into Elk Ridge, people were from Santa Fe, the galleries were standing along there buying pots as they came out of the burials. We have been able, most of them then, of course, just got distributed. We have been able to recover some. Danny's going to talk a little bit about this particular pot because the family of the landowner turned over a bunch of pots to the Mimbres Cultural Heritage Site. But you can just see the extent of damage. Fortunately, the there's still a lot intact there, even though it doesn't look like it. And fortunately, the Archaeological Conservancy now owns that part and it's totally protected. Thank goodness. We were contacted by the Forest Service to conduct excavations along that arroyo because rooms and burials were starting to erode out of that arroyo. So we started work in 2015 with my co-director, Daryl Creel, from University of Texas, Austin. If I get the wrong one, I don't know all the Texas schools. If I get the wrong one, he gets really upset. UT Austin. And then a group of volunteers and a group of students. And we started excavations there. Then we continued for 3 seasons with archaeological field schools. So many of the students in the department worked on some of those field schools. What we would do is we would excavate for a season, and then the Forest Service would come in and put gabions along there to protect any additional erosion. And so far they've worked, but we're hoping that they continue to work. Our research goals have been to gain insights into the Pueblo occupation and explore the relationship between Elk Ridge and other classic pueblos to the south, because we are in a little bit of a different setting. And we've done that by looking at 4 research questions now. We started with 3, and then we got interested in the last one as we were working there. The first was just to document the Pueblo construction sequence through mapping and wall abutting, looking at household organizations. How were these households organized? This comes based on work that's been done elsewhere in the valley. Harry Schaefer has shown that we have these multi-room suites that represent extended family households. We want to see if we have the same thing here. We think we do. Jared Miles is doing his master's thesis on the architecture, so he's really finding some interesting patterns in the architecture. Harry Schaefer in the south found these big habitation rooms with dual chamber hearths and multiple burials that he called core households. He saw these as representing the initial landowning households in the area, and we have 2 of those core households identified at Elk Ridge, so we're pretty excited. We also looked at ceramic technology and exchange, and Danny's going to talk all about that in a few minutes, so I'm just going to show you pretty pictures and move on. And then through our work at Elk Ridge, we've added a 4th research question, which is really, what was the role of Elk Ridge in the Classic Period community? 3 Circle is the pit house community that basically fed Elk Ridge into the Pueblo period. There's also a site called Cottonwood, also Ranger Station, that we did work out in, Danny, when did we do that? 2021. So right after COVID, we went out there and we did some work at 2019, and then we did some more mapping in 2021 to try to really get at what this community might look like. We're still working on that. Anyway, just to summarize what we found, we've excavated now 17 rooms. And I usually say at least 17 rooms because we've had so much remodeling, and they would fill in doors and add a room and take down rooms and make it into an extramural area. It's one of the most confusing sites I've ever worked at in my entire life. And so when I say we're still trying to tease this all out, it's because of things like this, where they had a door, and then they filled the door, and then they built a vent, and then they filled the vent and made another door. So we're still trying to figure this all out in terms of the construction sequence. We've also found a burned Ramada, and here's just some of the rooms that you see. Most of the architecture we found is this very clear cobble adobe architecture, very, very typical of classic Mimbres period sites in the area. But one of the coolest thing, and we have storerooms, these cobble-lined storerooms. So we've got storerooms, habitation rooms. We've got these slab-line hearths, a couple of these dual chamber hearths that Harry saw as so important in terms of defining these extended family households. Here you see a door that actually still had its little cover. And then the coolest thing that we found, in my opinion, is underneath that cobble adobe pueblo, we found an earlier adobe pueblo component. And this hasn't really been recognized at other sites in the valley. The problem, of course, is that later on they built these big cobble adobe pueblos on top. And so these rooms most of them were destroyed. This was just a really unique room and its little storage room, because instead of having a pueblo built on top of it, they converted it to an extramural area. So some of the house still preserved. And so we know that there was an earlier adobe component. We've got some sequentially used rooms, and this might be what the earliest components across the valley look like. We're still investigating that. The other cool thing is that adobe pueblo was built over a late pit house. This is a subterranean house, and that adobe pueblo room was built over it using some of the same walls. So why that is cool to us is that we have at Elk Ridge the pit house to pueblo transition in perfect, with these two walls. We've got just clear examples of that transition where they went from living in pit houses to living in pueblos. So we're really excited about that. The other features that we found, and these are going to be important for both Danny and Dylan's talks, we found a burned Ramada that we think was used for hosting feasts and basically parties. This is their party place for the households that were living and working in that area. And Danny's going to talk about some of the evidence for that. And then we found a midden with lots and lots of artifacts. The houses were usually cleaned out. So the houses had a few things, mostly broken. They had a lot of evidence of ritual retirement, closure activities, but not a lot of artifacts per se. So this midden has been a source of great information for us. Finally, in terms of how did Elk Ridge participate in this Pueblo world, one of the rooms we found was a turkey pen. It has a plug, a basalt plug. It was a small little room, and we found turkey remains in it. And then we found a bunch of other turkey burials. And Sean Dolan out of Los Alamos has done the DNA and the isotope studies on this. And all of ours were domesticated turkeys. The southern part of the site was excavated. Salvage excavation was done after it was looted, and they found a bunch of turkeys and a room that was repurposed into a turkey pen, and some of theirs were not domesticated. So that's really interesting, is that were they bringing in wild turkeys to kind of help out with the gene pool? We don't know. That's something that Sean's going to continue to look at. But we do know they were raising turkeys probably for trade. They were clearly trading ceramics. And finally, one of the more interesting things that we found that we're still investigating is it looks like, and Danny's going to talk about this, it looks like there are some folks from the north, from the reserve area and to the north, that moved into Elk Ridge and brought about some very subtle changes in both ceramics and architecture. And so we think that intermarriage and this interaction played a really important role in what happened at Elk Ridge. So I hope that whets your appetite. And I'm going to try to stop sharing. So I think, anybody know how I stopped sharing?
So there should be at the bottom of your screen where it says share.
Yeah.
Stop share. So click on that.
Doesn't say, I don't have a stop there. Okay, I'm going to go out and come back in. In the meantime,
Oh, you shouldn't have to do that. Okay.
I know, but I can't figure this out. I don't want to waste time. So, Danny, I'm going to turn this over to you, or Dylan, sorry. I'm going to turn this over to Dylan. Dylan is a PhD candidate about to defend his dissertation. Yay!
Yay.
And then Danny is also finishing hers. So Dylan will talk first about the lithics, and then Danny will come in and talk about the ceramics. And I'll be right back so he can share.
I'm still seeing the slideshows.
Her ghost PowerPoints.
Oh,
There
there
we
it is. Okay, all right. So,
Yeah, I had to cancel it out, so you should be free to go.
cool. All right. All right. All right, everything look good on your end? Cool. All right, let's do this. All right, so like Barb said, my name's Dylan Person. I've been a graduate student here at UNLV for a number of years, looking to defend my dissertation here pretty soon, so wish me luck. And part of that dissertation has been work on the Elk Ridge site. There we go. And my focus over the past few years has been on lithic technology and human behavior. So for lithic technology, that's technical systems of how people made stone tools and then used them, and then how those technological practices shifted with things like residential mobility and sedentism. So that makes Mimbres kind of an interesting time because that's when they were adopting agriculture, settling down into villages and that sort of thing. And I'm interested in how those kind of behavioral dynamics interacted with how they utilize their landscape and their geological resources in the area, which would be the Mimbres Valley. And I've actually been working on Elk Ridge since late 2015 with, it was originally a collections project with Human Systems Research, the firm that did the salvage archaeology on that south portion. So it's been very nice to, kind of bring that around as part of my dissertation and help to kind of clean up after all that devastation that happened at the site. And so just a little refresher for those who have yet to take Lithics 101 so lithic reduction is just making stone tools. You take a rock, you break it apart into what we call lithic flakes, which are the little guys trailing off to the right side of the screen. On the left is it's actually a reconstructed core from Elk Ridge, which I have never found up until then. And my wife actually found it during the pandemic, so that was fun. And of course, she's got the bragging rights now. Let's see. So just again, a little bit of a catch up for the talk. On the left hand, you see a lithic flake. It's a kind of a complete artifact in and of itself. And these were used either as tool blanks for more formal tools like scrapers or projectile points or what have you, or just as really easy one-shot cutting tools. It's a sharp piece of stone, and you can use it for anything you would need to cut with within a certain range of tasks. The top of the picture shows the proximal end or the platform. That's where the rock hit it to strike it off the core. It's got intact margins, and then it goes down to the distal end, which we call the termination, and that tells you things about how about flint knapping technique and other parts of the reduction sequence. There are other types of flakes where you get different fragmentary parts of it, and those have varying analytical value. And then on the right, it's just a piece of what we call angular shatter or debris. And that's just, sometimes the rock blows apart a little bit when you hit it with another rock. And it creates that. And it has analytical value too. But for this talk, I'll mostly be focusing on flakes because you have the full range of diagnostic attributes. This is just a very general this is what lithic reduction sequence looks like. So any reduction is going to broadly follow this in one form or the other. As you can see, it gets pretty systematic on the left side with formal tools. On the right side is more what I deal with the expedient one-shot flake tools. So, but usually what happens past procuring the stone, removing the flake, they strike off a flake, use it, chuck it, on to the next one. And I study that and try to reconstruct some of that so I can investigate style and artifacts. You know, most style we think about is communicative style, and that's based on a semiotic signaling. So, for example, this bat may have had some sort of meaning to the Mimbres people, or these the way the design elements are structured would have culturally significant meaning that the proper person could interpret. And we try sometimes in archaeology we can reconstruct that. It's always a lot of fun when we do. I work more with technological style because that's what you see on lithics. One of the problems with lithics is they preserve forever. They're rocks, but you just don't have much communicative style off of them because of how utilitarian and functional they tended to be. And the parts of them that tended to be stylistic in the way we think of communicative style were like decorations on an arrow shaft or something like that. And so, and other things that just don't preserve in the archaeological record unless you get very lucky. And so, but if you can reconstruct a technological style, which is the specific steps within that reduction sequence. So where did they, not just stone procurement, but where did they get it? How hard did they hit the rocks? How, what specific steps did they take in lithic reduction? Those kind of things. That comprises a technological style. And those tend to be passed down because it's almost invisible and rote. And if you get enough, you can make an argument for a technological identity, which is just a technological style strongly associated with a particular group. So to get to that, I have my flakes, which I had to come up with a composite attribute to show the morphology of the flakes. I mean, I kind of knew what they looked like pretty fast when I started analyzing these things because it's a very regular style, but you need data to support your arguments, of course. And so I came up with this as a way of using that for comparative analysis. And so you basically have the platform and the termination giving you both the distal and proximal ends, and then length, width, and thickness to give something measurable to compare. And from that, I make my arguments of technological style. So before I go into my findings at Elk Ridge, just a quick little note on regional geology. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you have a basalt. Lower left is rhyolite. Upper left is a chert nodule in a geologic layer. And then on the bottom right is, next to that little Toyota key, or some obsidian nodules from Mimbres. And these were the kind of major materials they would use. Chert and obsidian are very silica rich. Obsidian is natural glass. Chert, just the way it comes together as a sedimentary rock, it's very internally homogeneous, and it allows it to crack like glass, which gives it both the sharp edge and a predictable fracture. Now, the other two rock types, they're silica rich for what they are, but they're not quite as ideal for fine tool shaping. But as I'll show, for expedient tools or just flakes or whatever, very, very more than sufficient for what they needed. So, data time. All right, so as you can see, there's two major material types jumping right out at you: basalt and andesite or rhyolite. And really, that's more rhyolite. It's just a combined category given the kind of functional similarities between the use of the two stones. So they were using a lot of these coarser rocks for this kind of reduction. And the meaning behind that is these were all over the place, in and around the site area. Wherever you go across the landscape, these things it's very easy to pick up in the regional geology. It was a little bit harder, though I wouldn't call it extremely difficult to get chert or chalcedony. It just doesn't seem like they were using it as much in these areas. And the obsidian, the issue with the obsidian is, despite its very nice quality stone, it's just the cobbles are very, very small, and they're difficult to use to make anything besides maybe a small arrow point or something like that. And so we go to the platform, the proximal end of the flake. Again, a number jumps out at you, lots and lots of plane platforms. And a plane is exactly what it sounds like. It's just kind of a flat, unmodified platform. Kind of just looked at the core, found a good spot, and knocked it off. Of cortical platforms are pretty much the same, although they have cortex, stone cortex, the weathered exterior on there. And so that means they were probably from a little earlier in the reduction sequence, but again, not a lot compared to the plain ones. Faceted typically indicates some a little more systematic reduction. It's a flake platform with multiple platforms. And then the crushed was almost an outlier. There just weren't that many in there. And many were obsidian, which is a very brittle material to work with. Again, just to take everybody through it real quick, flake termination. So I found two major types, was feathered and hinged. A and B on that image are feathered. It's all it means is the force just kind of traveled smoothly through the core when it was hit, and that flake just detached very, very nicely. Didn't hit any flaws, you know, no problems with the transfer of force. It just came right off. On the other side, you see C and D, that's hinged. And that usually means there was something going on with the internal structure of the stone, or that they just hit it really hard and the force wasn't quite as controlled as with the feathered. So it swung off to one side, giving it that kind of swung off hinge shape. Again, pretty obvious which termination I found. Most of them were hinge terminations. They had some feathered ones. Those tended to be blocky as well, which I think was probably, you know, just as much of a result of material type as it was of a technique. And then a few overshots, and overshots are kind of like a little L shape on the bottom. It's the best way to describe them. And that tends to have to do with systematic core preparation. You need a certain type core shape to get an overshot, and so it just doesn't look like that's something they were doing at Elk Ridge. So I established a regular flake morphology that I have argued was primarily used as an expedient flake tool. Plain platforms, hinge terminations, a pretty average, regularly found length, width, and thickness. And I also judged it based on a performance analysis, how I would assess it in a task that I think it would be used for in these past contexts. And in this case, it would be resource processing, food cooking, things like that, you know, cutting and maybe some basic scraping activities. And at that size, it fits well in the hand. It's good for simple tasks. You don't need to make a whole formal tool. You can just knock off a flake, use it, throw it away, and get on with your life. Which is what I make my argument that this technological style represents. You know, they tended to go after coarser stone. That seemed to be what they were procuring for this, based on, you know, ease of access and the you know, lots of material type like that in the area. And then the pattern of attributes resulted in this kind of standard flake morphology, and that can be important for technological style because, you know, if you do something day in and day out, eventually you're going to start honing in based on how you learned it. And that's what I think these represent. Just something, you know, okay, I need a flake, bam, done. And that's just kind of what they wouldn't really think about it, but that's kind of what would be the standard. And then I think they were hitting them pretty hard. And this is a little bit anecdotal from my own experiences trying to flint nap on Mimbres rocks. But yeah, you have to hit it pretty hard to get it to crack right. But as you can see, it was possible, and they did a pretty good job with it over the time. And just to wrap it all up, an archaeologist, John Speth, he recently has described lithic tools as razor blades, which I think is wonderful for this because it's exactly what they are. You know, they used them, they dulled, they threw them away, they made another one, and so on and so forth. So just to contextualize it at the site, I should bring up this kind of what my original project goals were. So I looked at all the social units and the individual rooms and everything, you know, and how these rooms are related to each other, because I wanted to based on all this differentiation we have at the site, I expected to find some ideally tied to the social units, and then use means testing to figure out variation in lithic style and peg these certain types of regional identities. That's not what the descriptive statistics showed. It's pretty much the site pattern held true for everything. And so to kind of contextualize that a little bit, I wanted to talk about two of these contexts that Barb mentioned, the Ramada and the Midden. So the Ramada, great archaeological context. We know that, as Barb said, they're having parties, doing stuff, living life, and that's exactly what these kind of expedient flakes were used for. It was contemporaneous with some of the similarly shaded rooms. So yeah, and I got a pretty good amount of debitage off that area, out of the roof, wall, and floor. And then same deal with the Midden. You know, it's where they threw things away, and that's a great argument for that. Something is a complete artifact. So with lithics, is it a finished thing that they're using, or is it a tool blank? Well, they threw them away in great quantity. So I'm assuming that indicates that they were, again, razor blades that were just used and then thrown out. So in the Midden and Ramada, as you can see, lots of basalt, lots of rhyolite, lots of plain flake platforms. A little bit more variation in the flake terminations, but still by far mostly hinge terminations. And admittedly, you know, this is because a lot of my data was drawn from these areas because the rooms were very cleaned out, but nonetheless, they were associated with the room block. So it's a pretty good, you know, contextual association when it comes to this kind of figuring out this kind of stuff at sites. And then just to kind of bring it home, as you can see, length, width, thick, pretty standard across all the site areas between the Midden, Ramada, and full site. So I take that as evidence that I was on the right track with this. And then finally, just to kind of give you a little preview of what's going to be in the full version of this when I throw in all my case study sites, you know, I wanted to put in a little more regional context, especially because we do have a very characteristic Mimbres pit house under the Pueblo component at Elk Ridge, as Barb mentioned. So it seems like this was my other two sites are late pit house sites, so preceding the occupation at Elk Ridge that we excavated. And so it looks like this was inherited from previous chronological periods because you see the similarity all over the valley. And in stuff I've read on other member sites, it's pretty much, I don't have the exact data, but it seems like they're describing what I'm looking at. It's pretty obvious in the literature. And, you know, I just see this as it's a little bit, you know, you see some variation between the sites. One of my sites is out in Silver City to the west on the map. So that was a little outside of the members' core, but they still seem to be practicing it. So it seems like they were just able to kind of keep this thing loose and use a general style that was adaptable to wherever they were at in Mimbres. And it looked like it held up for quite a long time. So there was a maintenance of this regional technological identity, despite all these really significant changes that were going on elsewhere in other parts of Mimbres material culture and social life. And that could have been handled through any number of integrative mechanisms, you know, family learning groups, trade, all sorts of things. So I think that's a good place to hand it over to Danny, and she'll talk a little bit more about that in the ceramics. So, you know, thank you for listening to my talk, and look forward to your questions.
Is it there? It's all good.
Danny, you're either muted or very low. Yeah, we can't hear you.
Danny, if you look at the button that says mute, there should be a drop-down arrow that will give you audio options, and you might be able to switch it to your headset if it's not already on it.
Is this hopefully better?
Yeah, that's a
There we
little
go.
better. Sorry, we should have tested that.
Okay. Am I good now?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Bunch of changing everything. Okay. So, hi, I'm Danny. I am also a PhD student, not defending as soon as Dylan, but hopefully sooner than later. I worked at the Elk Ridge site all 4 years of excavation. I also did my thesis in the valley at the Harris site, which is a pit house village. I've always been interested in both ceramic technology and how it informs on interaction and identity. So for my dissertation, I really wanted to look at interaction both within the valley. What is Elk Ridge doing in terms of ceramic trade with a lot of the other member sites that are also ceramic production centers? And then can we get at interaction with the upland or reserve Mogollon to the north?
This does involve looking at some cultural identity practices, and it's not true Mimbres archaeology if your stuff does not throw you curveballs. So I also talk a little bit about individual identity as well, as we think we may have identified a potter at Elk Ridge. So the key kind of testing to look at how pottery is moving throughout the Mimbres Valley is with instrumental neutron activation analysis. It requires a nuclear reactor, and what that is doing is measuring gamma ray emissions of up to 70 different elements, of which 21 to 23 seem to be key for identifying the clay source in the Mimbres Valley. Clay sources in the valley are all distinct from each other, so we can get site specific. To do that, we first try and match up the criterion of abundance. So say if you excavated a pueblo, you got 100 vessels, you tested all 100 of them, and about 60% came back clustered together. That is most likely the clay source for that site. And then you go ahead and try and find other things that utilize the clay from the site that aren't necessarily ceramics to kind of help support that. So at Elk Ridge, we tested wall adobe, which came back exactly the same. And we also had an unfired vessel made by a child, which helped us identify for sure one of our sources. Elk Ridge had at least two. And then as we do additional sampling, it helps secure the groups and sometimes creates more groups. So for my samples, I tried to test almost every vessel that we recovered from our excavations. But then I also included some of the looted vessels that had been returned. I also tested all different wares. Usually when member ceramics are, the key topic, they're only looking at the painted stuff. That's the most pretty. But for plain ware corrugated, that's, a larger percentage of what you're getting. And with, when we're not testing those, are we missing part of the story? When we're talking about possible interaction with the reserve, plain ware and corrugated are actually more important because of what the upland do to their plain and corrugated wares. And so I went ahead and just included everything to see if I could get a more complete picture. Only 2 redware. That's, a low sample size, but that's pretty typical for Pueblo period components. By the time they're in the Pueblo, redware is almost extinct. So we were lucky to get the 2. So talking about more within the valley, what we're seeing, 65% of the vessels I tested came back to one of the 2 Elk Ridge sources. 65% is pretty typical for the production centers. A lot of NAA work has been done at the other large member sites, and 60 to 65% is consistent across the board for their own pottery being made at the site. One of the interesting things is Barb mentioned the site of Cottonwood, which is possibly part of the larger Elk Ridge community. It's only about a mile south of Elk Ridge, and what the results show is 2 vessels that, without a doubt were made by the same individual, came back. One came back Elk Ridge, one came back Cottonwood. So we don't know if we're seeing possible sharing of clay sources, which would be the first instance that we know of, or if, as we test more, that Cottonwood source may be absorbed by the Elk Ridge one. When it comes to the ceramic trade with the rest of the Mimbres Valley, we're actually not seeing much come in from the other large pueblos. However, from other testing, we know that hundreds of vessels from Elk Ridge are going out to them. So that leads to one of 2 things. The first and more unlikely is that Elk Ridge really isn't communicating in a back and forth. The second option, which is the more likely, is that Elk Ridge is getting something other than ceramics in return. Barb mentioned that the environment's a little different. Elk Ridge would have been more susceptible to frosts, early and late, so agriculture was more risky. So Elk Ridge was probably getting food in return instead of ceramics. Unfortunately, that's hard to test since organic material really does not survive. So the curveball. So the other Mimbres clay source is Mimbres 1A. It itself is very strange. There are only decorated ceramics coming out of this source. Compared to the other Elk Ridge source, which is producing corrugated plain decorated, produces everything. And then looking closely at the ones coming from this source, we start to see a lot of similarities. Execution of just these fine lines is probably the best I've ever seen. And then we have some stylistic traits that carry over a lot, mainly being these little triangles you see hanging off the bottom line, which we call drop pendants. Those are also worked into some other elements. And then whenever we see a figurative design, so either an animal or person or hybrid, they will have these large eyes. They tend to have trapezoidal or square heads, and then very small human-like hands, whether or not the main image itself is a human. So we've also noticed that these vessels, when they're coming from Elk Ridge, tended to be cached together. So the three larger ones came from the Ramada in a pretty extensive smashed vessel cache. And then the two from room 101 were both also in or near caches. So there may be some ritualistic importance to these, maybe importance of the individual. I also think this individual is using the other Elk Ridge source, as there are some that are very similar in design. It's still something that I'm playing around with. It's hard to identify potters, and with NAA we can kind of start re-looking at a lot of this now that we're assigning vessels to their sites. So when looking at reserve and Elk Ridge kind of interaction, one of the key things I was looking for with the ceramics was the presence of smudging. So all three of these vessels are smudged. And what it is just a thick organic layer fired on the interior. They fired it with a low oxygen environment, which turns it black. And then they highly polish it. So it kind of ends up with this obsidian look to it. The Mimbres do not do this at all. We've never really seen evidence at prior excavations for this, whereas the upland practiced this for over 1,000 years, and it appears on about 80% of their pottery. At other excavations of Mimbres pueblos, they'll see maybe one or two of these vessels pop up, and then about 1% of their assemblage will come up smudged sherds. So it has always been considered tradeware within the Mimbres Valley to see reserve smudge pottery. However, at Elk Ridge, from the first season, it became very apparent that we may be dealing with something else. Depending on the room, you can see that, plainware is up to 18% of the assemblage, corrugated up to 14%. And so it just seemed like this was going to be too much to explain away with trade. So I went ahead and tested everything that looked reserve, pottery, vessel-wise from Elk Ridge. And it came up, three things are happening. Well, two, but there's two things happening to one of those. First, we are seeing trade events happening or possible moving into the site of reserve individuals or families. We had, I believe, 3 vessels test to a known group up in the reserve area. And what happened is the inclusion of my samples ended up splitting that group into 3 subgroups. We're not sure exactly which site those come from, but we know it is up in the reserve area. I also had 4 tests to a completely new group that we also believe is up in the reserve area. But because it is completely new, we have no idea what site they were coming from. Right now, the analyst told me that it overall matches what is happening with reserve clays. And then over time, you know, as more samples are submitted, that new source group will likely also be burst apart into more. And hopefully at some point we can figure out which site or sites these are from. And then surprising to all Mimbres archaeologists, but not necessarily to me, was that we do have reserve smudge pottery being made at Elk Ridge, which to me made sense seeing how much of it we're getting. It makes sense that someone, a reserve potter, has moved into the site and is producing this pottery. A lot of it is coming from rooms 101 and 117. Again, a lot of it is being left behind in this kind of ritual nature, this closing of households. Number of caches in both of these households left upon retirement. Barb talked about it a little bit earlier, that there's some subtle differences in architecture that is really apparent in these 2 rooms. And then particularly in room 117, the barrel practices also match that of the reserve. Both members in reserve both place vessels over the face. Mimbres, we see a lot of that is decorated, but reserve only ever does smudge vessels in burials. And most of the 117 burials had smudge vessels over the skull. So there's still a lot on all 3 of our ends to figure out. Mimbres archaeology is complicated. It never really follows a complete universal. We end up seeing the split of, you know, whereas Dylan's stuff tends to fit more within maybe a valley-wide pattern. However, ceramics will usually kind of throw all the curveballs at you. And also our architecture is deciding to throw about 30 curveballs at us. So it's all still in the works, but we'd like to open up to questions to any one of us.
All right, thank you to our speakers. I gave you my virtual clap. I'll give you my real clap. Well, I wanted to open it up to anybody. I have some questions, but I want to open it up to the audience first. So I'm looking at the chat thread. Kara wants to know smudged pots, question mark. So I'm going to assume this is for you, Danny.
Or she may be thinking about the question a little more. So yeah, I can start talking about them and then what kind of paint was used. So we are a mineral-based paint out here. As far as what mineral they're using, we're not entirely sure. We're doing a lot of work with potters who do modern day reconstruction. One I talked to last year actually uses limonite, which is naturally yellow, and he gets it to fire black. So there's still even more work to be done about how they're firing pots. We've never found a kiln out here, so we're not really sure what's happening. Any functional use for the smudging? No. So there's really two types of smudging. One that, you know, a lot of cultures use. And what it is like the first time you cook in it, you kind of leave some of that residue in, and it helps kind of absorb into the wall so that you're not losing as much water later on. But that's really in jars. So for bowls where it's highly polished and this deep black, and a lot of times we don't see a lot of use on those bowls. We really have not figured out what the purpose of that would be, outside of just, you know, for looks. However, when we're looking at reserve sites and, you know, 80% of their pottery is smudged, you know, then most of their pottery can't be used if they're not using it. So, you know, in the Mimbres, maybe we're only seeing these kind of non-use smudge wares because they're more important to the to the reserve people living at the site.
Okay, does anybody else have, Kara, was your question answered? You said your original question got wiped. Yeah, okay, we're good there. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, I have 2 questions for Dylan and 2 questions for Danny. So Dylan, and I really appreciate that you are giving us a lot of data from your dissertation in just 15 minutes. So that's really, I know that takes a skill. So you probably would have ordinarily answered these questions if you were given more time. Dylan, when looking at, you had an entire core and refit flakes found. Was that found in a household context, like associated in a room or out in vacant terrain? Do you think these are, I guess the question is asking, are they crafting or flint knapping in a household context, or do they do this kind of outside of their homes? And I guess follow-up question, do you foresee this as like a specialized community of crafters, or just anyone's making flake tools as needed?
Well, I don't, got to go back to my notes. I can't remember exactly where that reconstructible was, but I can answer your question. No, I think they may have been doing, and this is actually, you know, kind of towing into the full version of the dissertation. I do have evidence of this in pit houses at some of the other sites. They weren't reducing in the houses. They might have been doing like little bits of tool maintenance. That's like, you know, you get, like, I got little chirp microflakes and stuff like that. So, which are pretty cool because they're tiny, but they've got all the diagnostics on them, like really good platforms, clear terminations, but they're like that big. But yeah, I think that, and it's one reason I chose to focus on the extramural area in Ramada is because, yeah, I think this was just kind of like day-to-day stuff. I don't think it was very specialized, especially given the kind of general distribution I tend to see across the assemblages. So, you know, this is just what people use, you know, day to day, real simple, you know, daily stuff. You know, you need to cook something up, you cut your vegetables, you throw it in the pot. You need to cut a piece of cord or leather or something, you just chop it real quick with your flake and move on with your life. So I think they were doing some reduction in the areas, but you know, most of the real heavy duty stuff they're probably trying to keep out of activity areas because, you know, they're sharp flakes of rock, so you don't want those underfoot all the time.
Okay, so then I guess that's my follow-up question. You have a fairly, seems kind of standardized types of flakes in terms of their size and their overall features. And you argue that these are flake tools, expedient flake tools. Do you have any with extensive use wear, or are they used so free, you know, they're used 1 time or 2 times and thrown away that you don't really have enough edge damage or use wear to determine that?
Well, you know, I originally had wanted to look more into use wear, but the kind of, again, it kind of comes down to what I was talking about with style. The durability of the stone makes it tough on those things like basalt, rhyolite. But having said that, yeah, part of our, you know, just general project methodology is to separate out, you know, retouch flakes, utilize flakes, things with those kinds of clear evidence. And mostly what I was analyzing myself wasn't that, but I did have, you know, access and incorporated that in. And what you see kind of across the board is chert and, the chert flakes, I think mostly they were chert and chalcedony. Those are the ones that tended to get retouched because they just lent themselves more to it from a material performance view. They were more predictable in the fracture. And then, but overall, no, not that many retouched flakes compared to the mass of debitage flakes that I saw.
And I can follow up on that because I did the tool analysis that originally when we first started this, before Dylan was even part of the project, we did, we started pulling out utilized flakes, and he did include those in his debitage study. But the materials there, and this probably, for you, Lisa, coming from the Maya region, I don't think you have this problem, but it was so hard to see it. And what we were finding is we were actually creating a category that wasn't real. We were creating, but it turns out once we did it I did it one season, and it was all the same material. And it became very clear that the reason that was turning out that way is because we could actually see the utilization on it. So we were actually creating false data. So we stopped doing that. So, but yeah, a lot of them had some evidence of utilization, but it just totally varied based on raw material.
I appreciate, I can appreciate that you're dealing with some ugly stuff. So that takes skill too. So way to go, Dylan. Danny, I had a question, and then I know we have a few in the chat and I want to leave time for those, but you said in the beginning that you have a big percentage of corrugated ware, and that's very important for what they were doing there. What did that mean? What is corrugated ware and what are they doing with it?
So corrugated ware is essentially just anything that has a textured pattern on the exterior. There is some argument that functionally it's good for cooking, but coming from my thesis, I knew there was also some identity tied in with how the designs were manipulated. When it comes to Mimbres corrugated, it tends to be just very standard, just corrugated coils, so just the lines. But when we're talking about reserve, they have various pattern styles. So almost all, I would say, of our vessels were coming up as these different patterns that we see in the reserve. And the functionality of those, who really knows? There is some studies later on up in the reserve where they actually start to paint the coils. And that researcher, Tammy Stone, is to the point where she can tell you what room those bowls are from based on the paint applied to the coils. So with the reserve, it may be more of identity marking outside of necessarily something functional.
Okay, so my second question is related actually to Kat's question, because you had said you weren't sure, the evidence was difficult to argue if they were trading for food in exchange rather than ceramic pottery for pottery. Has anyone done phytoliths or starch or anything on anything to see what kind of plant stuff?
So there is a great story that Barb and I have regarding I tested some of my vessels from my thesis site because they had this very deep erosion in them that we think is related to the brewing of corn beer. So we sent that off for analysis and it came back dirt. And so one of the problems that we have out here is the Mimbres soil is very acidic. And so we think for the most part it is eating away a lot of these residues.
Okay. All right. So yeah, that's going to answer Kat's question because she wanted to know if any food or remnants were left on the tools or the pottery, I would say. But Kara also wants to know, do you have any CCS sources nearby? Is it brought into the site?
Yeah, I think it was probably brought onto the site. One of the things about the Mimbres region is we don't have a very great map of that. That's actually something on my bucket list is to help out with that a little bit and try to map some of these sources in the region so we can get a better picture of how they were accessing these things. But having said that, I mean, there's a lot of chalcedony in a layer called the heloconglomerate, which just overlies huge swaths of the Mimbres region. Very, very accessible. There's outcrops all over the place. So I don't know about like local, but like I mean, I don't think they would have had to go very far to get this.
So I just have a final comment, I guess, more for Danny about, you had mentioned the fragmented and broken stuff that's buried. We get that so often in the Maya region. So I was just wondering if you had considered or looked at Chapman's discussion of fragmentation and enchainment in terms of those ritualized breaking and smashing of things and incompleteness. So I'll just throw that out there. Any other, it's 12:30 now, so our time is up, but thank you for coming back after spring break and getting us started again. So have a good rest of your Monday to everyone else. And thank you to our speakers once again for sharing your work with us. All right, have a good Monday, everyone. Thank you. See you next week.